County. Again, like Ms. Cochran, Mr. Carosa has several years of experience working in a variety of roles at Wake County Schools. In his current capacity, him and his team work to establish new attendance zones for these schools, as well as manage the multiple application periods where families have the ability to request a change of their students' schools. Once we hear from the responses from the field, there will be a quick summary by me again, and then we will open it up to Q&A. We hope to have at least 20 minutes available for Q&A. So with that said, we'll turn it over to Dr. Erica Frankenberg.
Great, thank you so much, David. David already went through the agenda of what I'm hoping to do today, so I'm just going to launch right in. Today, we know that we are more than 60 years from the Brown v. Board of Education decision, and yet the paradox is that we have rising segregation by race and class, and we know that these schools are both segregated by race, but also segregated in terms of the, sorry about that, the educational opportunities available. All right, I am unable to see this. Michelle, are you able to show the PowerPoint?
Yes, ma'am. I'm going to go ahead and take care of that for you. Give me 1 sec.
So I'll go ahead and get started while Michelle is helping this to work for the technical skills that are eluding me right now. So what we know from more than 60 years of experience is that the courts were a dramatic event in terms of helping to change the role of school segregation in the South. And I am particularly, I'll take a step back, I'm particularly excited to be part of this webinar because I grew up and attended schools that were desegregated in the South because of the Brown decision and other decisions like that, and so find this to be in a particularly important region, both for the country but also personally as well. Is it going now, Michelle? Perfect. So, though the Brown decision is rightly celebrated as the important milestone in our nation's history, we know that it actually took a fair amount of time for any progress to change, particularly in the South, which is where the Brown decision was particularly focused on. The South today is a region that is a majority students of color. Nationally, actually, our youngest children in the public schools are majority students of color, and that happened earlier in the two largest regions of the country, one of which is the South. So now we'll move on to looking at what happened in terms of school desegregation trends briefly before we talk about why it's important. This graph, I think, is a really helpful graph to help us understand the state of desegregation. And what we see is a couple of things here. First, the first decade after Brown, there was very minimal progress in terms of desegregation, and that's in part due to the way in which court decisions operated. That said, in the middle of the 1960s, rather, when we had both the federal courts as well as the federal executive branch because of the 1964 Civil Rights Act and the 1965 Elementary and Secondary Education Act, we saw dramatic gains, and by 1970, there were higher percentages of Black students going to schools with white students in the South than in any other region of the country, which is a point as a native Southerner I like to make that, in fact, while it was a Southern problem prior to 1954, by 1970, and really until very recently, the South was the most integrated region of the country for Black and white students. This pattern is slightly different if we were looking for Latino students, and I don't have that graph, but because of the way the court decisions operated, and I'm happy to talk more about that later, but I think the important point is to show that we did have dramatic change for Blacks in the South. Now, despite Southern progress, of course, this progress didn't last. The tools that worked in the South were not as successful outside of the South, in part because of the way we constructed that to be de facto segregation. And there were also limited resources available as the federal government was trying to figure out exactly what desegregation meant. And then when the Nixon administration came in, it was an administration that was fairly hostile to school desegregation and unwilling to use the effective enforcement techniques that had worked so well under the Lyndon Johnson administration. What did the courts do? A couple of key points that I want to make here. The 1971 Swan decision, which was really important in helping us understand the way in which schools and housing work together to either further segregation or could be used to further desegregation. And this is a point I'll return to later about the importance of housing. The Swan decision is also well known for being the decision that allowed for cross-district busing, saying that if you had segregated neighborhoods, you couldn't just rely on neighborhood schools, and that might mean you needed to transport students to non-contiguous zones or zones that didn't touch one another, and that was a perfectly acceptable tool to be used to create desegregation. The Keyes decision was the first in 1973 outside of the South, and it was also really important because, well, that of course is important because that was a state in which it didn't have laws that had required desegregation, but still found that there were other ways in which district policies were unfairly discriminating against students of color. This was also a really important point for specifying that Latinos were also allowed to have desegregation rights. Unfortunately, this came after the period of over-enforcement of desegregation, which is why we didn't see the same period of increasing desegregation for Latino students as we saw for Black students in the earlier graph. But it is a really important ruling for a couple of reasons. The Fifth Circuit, which was the circuit at the time that governed most of the South, was really important as well in trying to figure out exactly what school desegregation meant. It may seem obvious to us now with the benefit of hindsight, but in the 1950s and 60s, there was a lack of judicial clarity about what exactly full school desegregation meant in terms of complying with what the Constitution required. And in particular, the Fifth Circuit stepped in, adopting a number of the Federal Department of Education guidelines into law to say the different requirements that school districts were required. And these are some fairly far-reaching requirements at a time ahead of even what the Supreme Court had specified, and helped to bring wide desegregation across the South. So there's still some of these decisions that are active. For example, Jefferson is an ongoing case right now in the Birmingham, Alabama area, but still some really critical decisions at the time in the South. Beginning in 1974, the Supreme Court started taking some steps backwards in terms of its role as a desegregation champion. In 1974, in the Milliken decision, it limited the extent to which you could use other districts, and this was in Detroit, the metropolitan Detroit area. It limited the extent to which you could involve, for example, suburban districts in a remedy, even though the district court had said at the time you needed suburban districts in order to fashion an effective remedy. So this was a way in which the remedies started to be bounded and was a step backwards, particularly important in areas in the North and the Midwest, in which you had very fragmented metropolitan areas. By fragmented, I mean areas in which metropolitan areas were broken up into dozens, if not 100 or more school districts, often which were small and racially homogeneous. In the 1990s, there were some Supreme Court decisions again that lessened what districts were required to do, and then the 2007 decision in Parents Involved, it also struck down two voluntary integration plans. These are plans that districts had voluntarily adopted in order to try to further desegregation. But it also, at the same time, Parents Involved did talk about the importance of adopting voluntary integration plans. We can talk more about why that is in a minute or two. So where are we today? There are still hundreds of remedial court desegregation orders that exist, most of which are concentrated in the South, and there are some estimates of 100 or more districts that are voluntarily choosing to pursue desegregation. School segregation today, we know that it's multiracial. Today, in fact, Latinos are a larger number of students in our public schools and in the southern region as well than Black students are. So when we talk about segregation, it's not just the Black-white segregation that was the focus of most of the court decisions, but we need to think about multiple racial groups. It is larger in geographic context. Today, many of our most diverse school districts are in suburban areas, and there's rapidly growing segregation there as well. And we see that racial segregation often overlaps with economic concentration and linguistic concentration as well. So a couple of graphs real quickly to show you what school segregation looks like. I already mentioned the difference between the South and the other regions of the country. And in the graph on the next slide, we look exactly at the difference for Black students in the South. The southern region is this highest region. In 1968, almost 80% of Black students were in 90 to 100% minority schools. And you see by the 1980s, the lowest percentage were in these Black and Latino schools. By contrast, the Northeast region is the green line here we see, and we see that it's been a steady increase in segregation for Black students in these segregated minority schools. So very different patterns depending on what kind of enforcement was going on. The next slide shows us how this, and this slide was looking at K-12 students, but we see that this happens even in preschool. So these are looking at public preschoolers, and the main point to show is that even though whites are only about 41% of the overall preschool enrollment when it looks at preschools and public schools, they're exposed to a much higher percentage of white students and very few percentage of students of color. The opposite pattern is seen for Black and Latino preschoolers. They're going to schools in which a majority of students of their own race are part of those schools. So we see at a really critical developmental stage for preschoolers to be able to learn about difference at a time in which prejudice formation is beginning to start, that we're seeing already stark levels of segregation. Moving on briefly, and I'm happy to talk more about this later in our Q&A, what are some of the reasons for these patterns? There are lots of different reasons. We see on the left side here that there are a number of different education policies, some of which are student assignment, but there are also other policies as well, the creation of new school districts, where you build schools or where you close schools. And there are also other educational, non-educational policies as well, which of course are beyond the purview of school districts, but still have very influential effects. So there are lots of challenges of segregation today that then need to be considered in designing what you do. School choice can exacerbate segregation depending on how it is designed. We know that residential segregation remains very high. It's declining slightly, but the extent to which schools are tied to neighborhoods that's going to lead you with segregated schools. The way in which boundaries are drawn for school districts matter. And suburbs, I mentioned they're growing in terms of diversity, but they're also growing in terms of segregation. These are places that may not have a history with school segregation, desegregation efforts, because they may have been largely white a generation ago. And so helping these districts that don't have experience learn how to educate and equitably integrate students is a really important task. So moving on briefly, why does this matter? You probably know this if you have decided to attend this webinar, but I think we always need to remind ourselves of why this matters. Decades of research confirm that two things. There are schools that have high shares of minority students, are schools that have fewer educational resources, and these schools tend to have lower educational outcomes. This research has informed decisions going back to the Brown decision in 1954, more recently in Parents Involved, and it's also a key part of what's informed the federal government strategy under the Obama administration to help support diversity efforts. There's a growing body of research, and I think this is even more important to think about from an educational perspective about the benefits of integration for all students, as David alluded to. Their students of color as well as white students benefit from being in integrated settings, particularly if these schools are well designed so that they are equal status for all students, that students are not then resegregated within the school. It also helps to have integrated staff and faculty and a number of other benefits as well. These benefits are psychological in terms of reduced prejudice and stereotype formation. They're social. They help students want to live in more integrated lives as adults, and a range of different improved outcomes over the life course, particularly some researchers have found in studying African American students who went to desegregated schools after the Brown decision. These benefits then also help our communities when we have students who are graduating from schools with these range of benefits, and then are living and helping to lead communities as adults. So a range of reasons to pursue integrated schools. So how do we do this? And that's where I want to spend the bulk of the time here. First, I want to talk about some broad considerations here when we're thinking about what do we know about strategies for achieving integrated schools. To some extent, a lot of the newer research on this area has emerged in the last decade. And so after the Parents Involved decision, which limited some of the strategies that could be used. And so I'm going to talk right now about what we know, but I will be the first to say that there's also plenty that we don't know, and I'm happy to talk more about that. There are a range of different ways in which you can think about student assignment. I'm focused here on equitable strategies for integration. And what do I mean by that? I mean that there are strategies you can use that may or may not create integration, but they may also be inequitable to all participants. So for example, a strategy that uses competitive admissions may be unequal and unfair because not every family or student would have the opportunity to be prepared, particularly if, for example, it uses standardized tests or something like that to try to give admissions to magnet schools. So any magnet school is going to have a competitive admissions or admissions requirements may not be fully equitable. And there's other different ways. If you're not providing transportation, again, those are ways in which strategies might not be equitable. I do think it's really important, and we'll be thinking in the rest of the slides about the nuts and bolts of how to design it, but it's important to think about whether you're providing transportation, how transportation and other things might be a barrier to students choosing and being able to access the integration plan you're using. And so implementation details like that, like the provision of information, all are really going to matter a great deal in terms of whether this plan is implemented in ways that are equitable as well. So what are some different strategies? The first question that I think is important to wrestle with is how are you in your district going to define and measure diversity? And we've seen a real growth of this in the last decade or 2 decades. Whereas after Brown, it was predominantly thought about in terms of race only, and then traditionally usually Black or white only. Today we are seeing race in combinations with different socioeconomic characteristics, or sometimes we're seeing socioeconomic status alone. So you need to first think about how are you going to measure diversity, and we'll look at this more in a later slide. And which characteristics are you going to use? Second, what kind of scale are you going to use to measure diversity? We know from literature that there are lots of different reasons that you might want to think about the student's neighborhood, and because of the neighborhood factors and the ways in which that affects children and their opportunity, that you might seek to have a diversity of students in a school that come from different types of neighborhoods, rather than seeking diversity at the individual student level. This also may provide you with more flexibility if you want to incorporate measures of race along with socioeconomic status. So you can measure diversity in thinking about individual students, or you could treat students in a small neighborhood all the same way for diversity purposes. You could also measure diversity at the school that a child attended. For example, trying to get a diversity of children in the middle school from different types of elementary schools, depending on the school's diversity. So lots of different possibilities that exist. And then you need to think about how exactly you're going to use, what method you're going to use to assign students. And so some of the most commonly used for diversity are attendance zones, controlled choice, magnet schools, transfers, or some combination. Briefly, to touch on sort of some strengths and weaknesses of each one of those, attendance zones are very common in that they affect the assignment of all students. So one of the strengths of this approach is that every student will be subject to the diversity measure. A drawback, of course, is that we have residentially segregated neighborhoods, so you might need to think about non-contiguous attendance boundaries. And you might need to think about frequently redrawing it, because we know the average resident moves on average every 6 years. And so very quickly you can see how those residential zones may be established as being diverse, but within 5 to 10 years they may not be quite as diverse as they were, and that might particularly be more likely to get out of balance in places that are growing rapidly. Controlled choice is another way in which it affects the assignment of all students. Students submit choices, and then the district decides how to grant them based on student preferences, space in school, as well as diversity as well. A downside to this is that you need to make sure that all schools are of interest to all groups, and you need to also make sure that there's not any concern about a lack of stability for students in terms of not knowing exactly where they will go. Magnet schools and transfers are two types of strategies that may not affect all students. So usually magnet schools are used in combination with another diversity strategy, but unless every school is a magnet, it's going to be limited in its reach. And then transfers usually only apply after initial an assignment has been made, so that may only affect a small percentage of students. So using a transfer that has a diversity component could help, but it may not reach every student. And so balancing those different strengths and weaknesses as you think about what kind of assignment method is really important to think about. So delving a little bit more into how to define socioeconomic status, the most common way historically that has been used is using student eligibility for free or reduced lunch. This had a number of benefits. First of all, most districts were collecting this information, and it also didn't ask families for very intrusive privacy questions. Some questions have emerged as the extent to which this is accurate, and particularly with school districts moving to the community eligibility provision, it may not be the best measure to use anymore. If you are using it, some districts have started asking consent to use this information for assignment purposes, so that might be something to add. There are, however, a growing number of possibilities that are alternatives for defining SES, and some of these research suggests may actually be more effective than free and reduced lunch eligibility, which is a binary measure. So census information exists and is being used through the American Community Service on a rolling basis. It can help describe a neighborhood, for example. Eligibility for government programs targeted to low-income households may be a way to get at socioeconomic status on an individual basis. For a kindergarten assignment, you could ask whether a student has attended a Head Start or preschool, which again could help be a measure of economic diversity. And then some inter-district plans use residents in an urban district to think about whether you're eligible to participate or not. These are certainly measures associated with socioeconomic status, but you can see each one gives you slightly different information depending on what your goals as a district are, and it'd be really important to tie your goals to what you decide to use. Other measures that are being used that aren't necessarily SES-based are academic achievement, either of the schools or the neighborhood that the student lives in, English language proficiency. Again, the research suggests very clearly that how you're defining SES matters. in terms of the overall effectiveness. In addition, your community and demographics are going to matter a great deal too. The extent to which students may also help to produce racially diverse schools are going to matter, the extent to which race and SES are connected in your local community. And providing things like transportation would also help make these feasible. We have seen in the last decade a growing use of people using non-binary measures of SES, which research suggests is going to be more effective in creating economically and racially diverse schools. Moving on briefly to the race-conscious policies, which are still being employed in a number of districts. The most common way in which this is happening is what I call multi-factor plans. And this, again, can be used either at the individual level or at the community or neighborhood level as well. It uses a combination of both race and socioeconomic factors, often used to assess neighborhood composition. So examples are Nashville, which we'll hear about in a few minutes, Montclair, New Jersey, Louisville, Berkeley, Ector County, Texas. So a really wide diversity of communities are using this approach. Each one uses the diversity factors in a different way, even a different number of factors, and they also measure neighborhood in a different way as well. But this is potentially able to address some of the concerns in the literature that SES-only plans may not be as effective in also creating racial diversity. So some of my evidence-based recommendations from reviewing the literature, and some of these will be up in a few weeks on the IDRA site. First, for designing the policy, here are a couple of things I recommend. I think I would strongly consider using race-conscious policies as part of an overall diversity strategy in combination with other socioeconomic strategies as well. I think it's really important to think about the extent to which proximity isn't being included in plans because of segregated neighborhoods. Giving a proximity preference may be offsetting any benefit you get from other diversity type strategies. You need to integrate student assignment into all parts of your comprehensive district plan, again, to make sure that you're not doing the best job you can in student assignment that's being completely countered by other decisions you're making as a district, such as where you're building schools that might exacerbate segregation. I think it's really important to engage with other sectors, such as housing, think about working also across school district boundary lines. And then it's important to add in school-based supports where you're creating diverse schools and being sure that you're being transparent about the outcomes, discussing what as a district you will see as the goals and outcomes you want to achieve. Just as important as design, getting the policy design right, I think is getting the political support right. And certainly we know of a number of districts in which there has been some political discussion around whether the design of a school diversity policy. So I think it's really important to think about educating and engaging with the community about diversity, reminding families about why you're doing it and the way in which you've decided as a community to what goals you're trying to achieve through your diversity policy. Make sure that you're assessing whether the plans unevenly distribute benefits. So often we know from prior experience that African Americans in the South, for example, bore a lot of the burden of desegregation plans that are being implemented, and making sure that that all groups are sharing in the burdens and also the benefits of these plans. I think it's really important to be transparent so that families are trusting the administration of the plan and that one group isn't being advantaged over the other. Some districts, for example, have annually issued reports about who are submitting choices, who's getting them, how integrated the schools are. I think that could be a really important thing for a community, both in terms of transparency and also going to my last point, which is it helps you review the success of the plan and adjust it as it's needed. So having someone who can help do some GIS analysis to think about whether boundaries needed to be tweaked slightly, or evaluating under a choice plan if preferences are seeming to, there are schools that are either underchosen or extremely popular, can really help you think about adjusting programs, for example, in some of those schools to meet the needs and to make the needs, the preferences even out better across school districts. Beyond the school district, briefly, I think it's important to consider inter-district diversity efforts. So Hartford is one example, but it's also really important, just as we're thinking about within the school district, across school districts, there can be ways in which choice can further exacerbate segregation. So making sure that the same principles you apply to any within district plan, you're also applying to between just district plans as well. I think the states can have really important roles. So we're seeing some of that in some of the ESSA plans and the non-academic indicators that can advance diversity goals. Thinking about school district boundary lines, even the way in which charter schools are established and the kind of requirements they have for diversity, or other ways in which the state can help to promote diversity as well and support the efforts of local school districts. And then I think it's really important to think across other policy domains. So Montgomery County, Maryland is an example of a place that partnered with low-income housing efforts to also create socioeconomically diverse schools and found some real benefits for low-income students from low-income families. Partnering with transportation partners in the community, thinking about public transportation if it exists and how it can support school diversity efforts, you know, both for students but also for families to be able to get out and go to the school that their child is assigned to. And then thinking about the business community, in some areas they've been very supportive of talking about the importance of having a diverse community and diverse schools, and so they could be another potential partner in this work. Because I do think it's really important that schools are not just doing this alone. So to wrap up, a couple of things that I wanted to just summarize, and happy to talk about this more in depth. First, politics, demographics, law have all made this even more complicated than it was a generation ago. That said, we know more than ever about the benefits of why this is important, and I think that there are more technological tools such as GIS and census data that's available online that can help assist school districts in the technical aspects of trying to design that. And I think there are groups like IDRA and other groups, the National Coalition for School Diversity, my Civil Rights Center website, a range of different places to look for resources to support what the work that you're trying to do, connect with other districts that are trying to do it as well. There are millions of children who continue to attend public schools as a result of the integration plan, and we know that that's a crucially important part of their education, that they can't get in either a homogeneous white or a homogeneous non-white school. How integration is structured inside the schools matters a great deal, however, as to whether those outcomes are going to be achieved. It's important to think about both the design of the diversity policy as well as the implementation to make sure that it's fair and equitable for all students and all families. And then we continue to need more research about what is permissible and effective in terms of what strategies work and under what conditions. That's work that I have ongoing right now, and I'm happy to share with anyone who's interested more specifics in terms of the catalog of districts we have and what diversity policies are implementing, and what we see in terms of the effectiveness in studying the segregation trends over time. And then, as I mentioned, there are also roles for the state as well beyond the school district. For more information, please feel free to contact me, and I look forward to your questions at the end.
Across the country today. We next will have Chris Weber again from Metropolitan Nashville Public Schools in Tennessee. Take it away, Chris.
Hey. So, David, can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
Okay, perfect. All right, awesome. Well, thank you so much, David, for inviting me to speak with your audience today, and for Dr. Frankenberg for her presentation and sharing her knowledge earlier. I'd like to just take an opportunity today to speak to you a little bit about the challenges that we face here in our district in Metro Nashville Public Schools, as well as the opportunities that those challenges present to us. And lastly, I'll speak just briefly about some of the periodic changes in review that, we keep in mind here and that other districts should consider. So just to get started, as Dr. Frankenberg mentioned, the housing patterns tend to not be diverse. There are some areas that are diverse, but typically the diversity in the housing patterns present challenges to creating diverse schools. And most recently in Nashville, we're concerned about affordable housing prices. As our economy has recovered and has improved, the housing prices have also increased to the point where recently we've seen some enrollment shifts that are concerning. For the first time in our district, our enrollment has actually decreased slightly, and this is the first time that's occurred since 2001. And while that enrollment decrease was a modest drop, the trend is concerning, and it's something that we're paying attention to closely, as it could affect both resources and the diversity of our schools. In addition to that, charter schools in Nashville continue to grow, and as the enrollment of the charter schools grow, that tends to leave behind many of our district schools that are under-enrolled. Now, specifically, there's some geographic areas in Nashville, like North Nashville and East Nashville, where there's several schools that have seen significant enrollment declines. And when these enrollment declines occur, the schools tend to be smaller. And with the smaller enrollment, you tend to be less diverse schools and further increase racial isolation, which is concerning. And that's also compounded by the fact of the utilization concern when you have such small schools, the effective use of resources that occurs with that. In addition to that, we have quite a bit of choice in Nashville, and we know that to make choice effective, and we need to provide transportation. But due to the geographic constraints, the distance and time limitations, transportation can be very expensive, and the enrollment distribution of our choice schools and the students there make it real hard to provide efficient transportation plans. So that kind of summarizes up some of the main challenges that we face. There's many more than just that, but with those challenges, it poses opportunities that we look to take advantage of. And here in Nashville, we're very fortunate to have a school board and district administration that is supportive of diversity measures and supports the diversity initiatives in our district. And without their leadership, it wouldn't be possible for us to promote diversity here. So in addition to our leadership, another big opportunity is just the diversity of our district and the diversity of the entire Nashville community. So our district is 29% white Caucasian, 23% Hispanic, and 43% Black African American. And so as a whole, that's very diverse. And the economically disadvantaged is about 43.5% economically disadvantaged. But it's important to know that the economic disadvantage rate has dropped significantly because that rate is based strictly on direct certification. So just a couple years ago, we were collecting free introduced meal eligibility. And when we were looking at how many of our students were eligible for free introduced meals, it was closer to 70% of our district was eligible for free introduced meals. Since our district has implemented community eligibility, where we provide free lunch and meals to all of our schools, we no longer collect those same forms, and so we rely on direct certification, and the number of students has dropped differently. So that's an entire kind of demographic than what we previously measured. And we continue to struggle actually to be able to directly connect and have families that sign up for those services. As a whole, this diversity is a big asset, so the diversity of Nashville in our schools. And just like any asset, it needs to be managed to make sure we take advantage of it and continue to promote and grow the diversity asset that it is. So in 2013, through board leadership and the leadership of our superintendent, this district adopted a diversity management plan. This is my computer went to sleep for a second. So in 2013, our district implemented a diversity management plan, and this is a very comprehensive plan that takes a holistic view of diversity within our district and our schools. And so it looks not only at student diversity or the school diversity level statistics, but it also looks at staff diversity. And in addition to staff, it ties in student achievement, because we know that all of these metrics tie in together to really make a great school, and diversity as a whole is a much broader topic than just only looking strictly at just the racial ethnic makeup of a school. In this diversity management plan, it calls for the district to consider the diversity impacts before making district level decisions. So decisions that directly relate student assignment might be things such as school siting, rezoning plans, school choice policies, where to locate choice programs. All of these decisions at a district level, we take into account the diversity impact of these decisions and try to come up with a solution that promotes diversity at all where it's practicable. Now, following the 2013 Diversity Management Plan, about 3 years ago, our district implemented, we started with 3 early learning centers. So as Dr. Frankenberg talked about the importance of early childhood education and diverse settings for students in pre-K, you know, we started 3 early learning centers, and these are big, they're larger comprehensive schools that are focused only on early childhood education. And we've now since added a 4th school just recently, and 3 of these schools are very diverse plurality schools, and these schools previously weren't diverse. And so through recruiting, through strong academic programs, these schools are able to market and recruit in a diverse student population. And these pre-K centers help to set the standard and show as a model for all of our pre-Ks across the district, and so we look to build off that. Due to some housing patterns in areas of the city, we do face some extreme racial isolation in some geographic neighborhoods, and in those real challenging areas, we have implemented what's called zoned options, and so these are direct choice options for families that live in these areas to have a guaranteed choice to a more diverse school setting with transportation provided. And so while I said transportation can be challenging, these are areas where we provide yellow school bus transportation. It's a guaranteed choice, and the diversity benefits not only the families in those areas being able to choose a diverse setting if it's better for their family, but also it benefits the diversity of the school that is also receiving those children as well. In addition to zoned options, we've most recently applied and we're fortunate to be awarded a Magnet School Assistance Program grant from the U.S. Department of Education. So we are implementing 5 new elementary magnet schools, and so these are schools that can benefit by improved diversity and benefit by improved academic programs. So we're very excited about the programs, and that's just one opportunity for how we're promoting diversity and improving the education in these schools. Lastly, what Dr. Frankenberg mentioned about partnerships with other government agencies. One example of that here in the district is that we partner with both the Mayor's Office and the Public Transportation Authority to provide free public transportation to all of our high school students, and that's called MTA Stride. And that program also is pushed into the middle school tier level for families that want to ride public transportation. This program is integrated in with the student ID badge, so our student cards, our student badges actually activate public transportation. So it allows families that want to get across town due to school choice that accessibility. But this program is not only just for getting to and from school. The program is 12 months a year. It's all day long. So it also allows families or children that need to the opportunity to get to extracurricular events or use it to get to summer programs throughout the summertime. And so that just summarizes a few examples of how we're promoting diversity in the district here. I think lastly, just things for your participants to keep in mind as a district as a whole is the need for periodic review. Due to a variety of factors, I mentioned the demographic shifts that are occurring now and continue over time. You need to study those trends and react to them, and that's something that we do here in the district. But in addition to not only just the geographic and demographic changes that occur, but also the political changes that occur, whether it be state legislation and laws, whether it be the board leadership and governance policies, or district leadership. Every time that there's these types of changes, there needs to be the alignment between strategic plans and make sure the district's diversity initiatives are aligned to make sure they're as effective as they can be. Anytime these are occurring, the community engagement is also critical to make sure that the community understands the rationale and the desire, sorry, I lost my feed again. Community engagement is critical to make sure that the community understands the rationale, the desire for why diversity is so important, and to actually have to encourage the community to support these diversity initiatives. That's kind of at a broad district level, but at the school level, school-based staff, we need to be trained on cultural competency to make sure that that cultural competency exists at all levels within the school leadership, because schools need to understand the diversity and be welcoming to families, be able that they can meet the needs of the students and be supportive of that. And so those are some of the efforts we're encouraging here. David, that wraps up what I've got to share. And so if we want to pass the mic on to Glenn, I'll be happy to do so.
All right, well, thanks very much, Chris. Very much appreciated the great information that you shared on the challenges and opportunities that you're experiencing there in Metro Nashville, especially as it relates, to much of the research that Erica said. Next, again, we'll have Dr. Beth Cochran and Mr. Glenn Carosa from Wake County. So you all can take it away again and share the information from your school system there. Thank you.
Share.
We're waiting for the share button to. Okay, so good afternoon. I'm Beth Cochran, Senior Director of Magnet Programs in Wake County, and then we also have Glenn Carosa, the Senior Director of Student Assignment. We just thought to start with to share about our district so you know about the size. It's a large school district like Nashville that Chris talked about. There are about 180 schools, and 51 of them are magnet or early college. A real key part of our district's kind of guiding principles are that we have magnet principles and objectives that every couple of years we do a review of our magnet schools and diversity in our district and re-look at the principles, but really these principles that you can see on the screen have been the same for the last, fairly close to the same for the last 20 or 30 years. And they're reducing the high concentrations of poverty, promoting diverse populations, maximizing use of school facilities, and providing innovative and or expanded educational opportunities. So all the decisions that we make in regards to magnet schools and in trying to have diversity in our district are guided by these principles. So one of the things we're going to talk about in a little shortly are our magnet student selection priorities that mirror these objectives. So I think it's really important to have some kind of guiding principles for your district. And then a little related to what Dr. Frankenberg was talking about, in the late 1990s, Wake County had been using race-based student assignment policies for diversity, but we moved to the socioeconomic diversity for the selection priorities, partly because of court decisions that were coming down. And so then we've overall used socioeconomic for the last 17 years. There was a little bit of a blip in there, but overall we've been using socioeconomic selection priorities since then, and you'll hear those in more detail in a minute. Also, then, okay, I already said, sorry. We use the node or a catchment area as far as to decide. Obviously, we're not using individual student socioeconomic data. We're using it by node of residence or their catchment area.
Selection criteria.
Yes. Yeah.
Continue on here.
No, go ahead.
All right. So last year, these are our selection criteria that we used last year. And you can see we used socioeconomic status, of the particular area where the student lives, whether the node or catchment. We also had it broken down by school, and then we also use school crowding. And we use different permutations for each school as we go through to try to maximize the goal of what we're trying to do with the selection process. And going back to what Chris had mentioned, reviewing that data every year is really important, because what we found after this year was having too many different factors. It was, you know, high socioeconomic status of the district, of where they live, and of their next school, and the high crowding of the next school limited the number of high-quality participants that we could select for those particular schools. So what we did was we ended up breaking it down to using just the socioeconomic status of the neighborhood, the catchment, and the school. And so what we felt was we were seeing a correlation between the crowding, and so our higher crowded schools generally had lower FRL students. So we were able to kind of use that as a proxy to say we don't need to have that extra and priority in there to limit the applicants. So what we did was we backed it off, and we're going to see how the data shakes out for this year. But we work with NC State and Dr. Bob Hammond in the economics office, and they help us crunch this data. They do the selection process for us, and then we meet with them every year to go through, you know, what worked, what didn't work. Are we hitting our target areas? Do we need to change our, each school has a zone where students can apply from. Do we need to expand those zones or shrink those zones? What else?
Theme essentials. Okay. So we're leaving the path. Okay. So another key part of having successful magnets that attract people that then help you have diverse schools is having strong magnet themes. So I'm not sure if everybody's able to access this, but we have the document that shows all of our magnet themes in the district and kind of the key theme essentials that make up that theme that they have to have in order to be unique. And that also serves as the way that we're marketing those schools to be different. So I just wanted to emphasize that part, that it's important to have a strong theme. And then tied to that, you're now seeing a magnet program pathway chart where in the selection priorities in middle and high school, they get, after siblings, the first priority is to follow their program pathway. So obviously if you're in an IB program in elementary school, then you get a priority to middle school IB, you get a priority to high school IB. That also helps with stability in our district, and in our district it's a large and growing district constantly, so there's a fair amount of reassignment purely because of growth, and so that serves as another attraction for magnets, is to have that stability.
And one of the issues we have with reassignment is one of our pillars does focus on socioeconomic status, but we don't have the, we lose people? Are we still here? Can everyone still see us? Yeah.
Hey Glenn, I can hear you, Glenn, but I can't see you.
Okay. Let's see what happened.
Yeah, we're working on bringing up the screen. Which screen do you want to be brought up right now, Glenn? Because we're not seeing anything on the sharing, on your sharing side. With the different documents.
I don't think we need to share anything at this point.
Okay. All right.
We shared all of our screens. I think we were just talking about, though, the issues we have with reassignment are, we do have a certain pillar in our reassignment policy that does talk about student achievement, which we were able to use as a proxy for FRL. But the problem we're having is we're a county-wide school district, so we do not control building permits from the municipalities. And so, like Nashville, we're seeing more segregation of neighborhoods and towns based on the unaffordable home prices that are being that are going up in these neighborhoods and towns. So It gives us schools that are not proximate to equitable areas that we can balance the schools. So that's one of our main dilemmas that we work with. And our board is good to try to balance some of the schools within the areas, but we do get some pushback in other areas. So that becomes one of our biggest challenges, is the proximity.
And then also, as the district has grown, to go to one side of the district to the other takes, a lot longer than it did 20 years ago. So that's a challenge, but we do have strong magnet transportation support for all of our magnet schools. I know that was something that was in Dr. Frankenberg's PowerPoint, and so we do have magnet transportation at all of our magnet schools, so that's really important.
And we have a phenomenal marketing program and communications department that works with trying to get this, and that works with trying to get this information out to all families as well.
I think that's it for us, and we're open to questions when that part comes.
All right, great. Thank you very much, Beth and Glenn. Wake County definitely has an aggressive and intentional plan. Many districts, across the country have been looking to Wake. I know Wake is trying to adjust, different moving parts and pieces, especially because of the tremendous growth that the city and county has been experiencing. So that continues to be a great, area of opportunity. And it's important to note that many of the school districts here and across the country are engaging in these voluntary efforts. As Erica mentioned, there's close to 100 school districts that we're aware of that are doing voluntary desegregation efforts, and there are other, well over 100 school districts that we're aware of, including 97 that are still subject to ongoing school desegregation orders under active school desegregation cases in the South alone in our Region 2 of our federally funded Region Center. So lots of great opportunities. If you have any questions, please post those to the Q&A. One thing that you should know is that we will have the all documents are available through the web page that you were able to link here today. I definitely would appreciate if anybody has any questions to pass those through the Q&A. One question that I would like to exercise, the prerogative here is posed to Chris and Beth and Glenn, and I was wondering if you might be able to share briefly the communications that you've had and the role of families and community in helping to design or provide feedback on your school integration plans.
So one of the things that we can talk about as far as communication with the community, we did do, Glenn talked about the municipalities, maybe it was 3 or so years ago, focus groups in each of the municipalities, and then of course in the Raleigh city as well, asking questions about how they felt about diversity, of course also asking them what kind of programs and that they would want there, but really kind of trying to get a read. When we do those, we get generally positive support, but then again, when you're doing focus groups, sometimes you're getting the people that are supportive, but that's one way that we try to reach out. It's something we need to do more often and ongoing.
Okay, great.
Hey, David, this is Chris. I can respond from Nashville. Part of our diversity management plan calls for us to use a community task force for student assignment and diversity matters. So part of the diversity plan has internal work groups, but there's also a community-based work group. So these members are appointed by the school board and represent the various communities of Nashville, where it's a sounding board where we can share with them demographic trends, share with them various rationales, and they provide feedback to the district. But I think that not just only within inside the diversity management plan, but the community engagement is critical across all of the various decisions the district faces. So like recently this year, we were looking at possibly changing tier levels, whether we needed to adjust from a K4 to a K5 tier level, which is a significant change. And we got a lot of community input and engagement, and based on that engagement, we actually modified our plans. But anytime we do rezoning, we share with the community diversity trends and get their input, and the same thing with school siting decisions as well. It's important to know too that not always are the community engagement efforts just holistically positive. Oftentimes these can be divisive conversations, as some parents, especially as the conversation is targeted to a specific neighborhood and rezoning a specific neighborhood, families oftentimes might be reluctant to change. And so it's important to engage them in that and get as much feedback as possible to make the best decision.
I'll just add a couple of things based on what Chris was just saying, and that is in a number of places we've seen community engagement, particularly around redrawing attendance boundaries. Typically it's families that are pushing for a more segregated option. So having a really clear plan and thinking about how to message around diversity, the goals of the plan ahead of time. There's some resources that I've worked with to produce to help how do you talk about the benefits of integration, because parents really, they're going to look at where their house is on the maps and how the zones that are redrawn are going to affect their kid and their family. And so really being able to also talk about it from a district-wide perspective is really important. And the other thing I would just add to what the Wake County experience was is that in the surveys I've known of parents around school integration efforts, so these are people that aren't just going to be self-motivated to attend a focus group, but should theoretically be a random sample. There's incredibly high support among families that have a long history of doing integration. And Wake County, I think, even did a survey of teachers, and the teachers were very supportive of diversity efforts. And so there are a number of different stakeholders, I think, to bring to the table, and I wanted to just bring out that teachers can be a really important part of this community dialogue as well.
Excellent. Thanks very much, Erica. There was a question about the diversity of the benefits of diversity that are in higher education, so post-K-12. I'm not sure how much experience you have in that area, Erica, but if you might be able to share some there, and I can certainly, add from, my involvement in those areas as well.
Sure. So I think it's really important to think about integration across the educational pipeline, and so I appreciate this question helping us think about, we've been focusing on K-12, but of course it both pertains to 0 through 5 age children as well as beyond high school as well. And I think actually my reading of the literature is some of the most important benefits of K-12 schools are what helps after you graduate. Well, first of all, it helps students graduate, but then it helps you get into school, to college and beyond. So we know that a lot of the benefits of integration actually have arisen from our studying of the benefits of diversity in a higher ed context. So beyond what I've talked about already, in the Grutter decision and the Fisher decisions more recently, there's been a range of literature that talks about the importance of having diverse perspectives in a classroom conversation. As a professor myself, I am desperate to get a diverse group of students. I don't want students who have all had the same experience. But you get into much deeper discussions when you have a range of different perspectives on a particular topic. And the literature shows that it helps to improve critical thinking skills. So a range of different ways in which we know that diversity in higher education matters. And we know that diversity in K-12 makes students more likely to seek out diverse experiences in college. So there are really some important perpetuation benefits and ways in which I think ideally colleges and universities would work with K-12 school districts and vice versa, because we need to be integrated in our working on integration together, I think.
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, from that, collective intelligence that is gathered, from having more diverse interactions, there's improved physiological reactions that have been cited in the research, lower anxiety levels as well, due to the peer interaction, improved civic engagement. I mean, there's tremendous benefits from diversity in higher education, especially, that have been cited over the years, and continue to better prepare students for post-college life, which is probably one of the most important goals of all education. I wanted to get back to, am I going to be able to share this? All right. All right.
Application.
There we go. And all right, we're learning this slowly. At least I am. Earlier when we were talking about the equity-based integrated schooling framework, I didn't go into this in depth. I'm not going to go into it in depth now, but I think it's important, to see the full picture. And what this framework is, for those who are unfamiliar with this framework, it was just released last month. It will have an accompanying narrative that is currently being drafted by the 4 equity assistance centers, just to shed some light on some of these pieces or elements that are included here. So what does authentic community engagement mean, for example? Is it one-way communication where school communities are simply trying to get affirmation for what they want to do, or is it actually inviting them to the table for their own opinion, irrespective of what their goal might be, and how are they being interacted with? What are the levels of communication? So we, again, created this from a very strong equity-based perspective. The 3 major pieces to this are an inclusive co-constructive planning approach, school-based supports, and outcome measures. How are we gauging this? Is it solely, based on student achievement, or is there an examination of the opportunities to learn between schools if it's a whole district plan, integration plan? What are the impacts on social climate? What are the impacts on student success that would include grade retention, that might include graduation rates, dropout rates, and the like? And then integrated schooling, how much are the different classrooms within a school actually being integrated? This is an incredibly flexible framework also, so there are different pieces that school districts may not want to engage or already have engaged. Maybe they're looking to improve, and they can look at this framework all in one piece and see where they might, are there different professional supports? And again, we're going to identify those professional supports that have been shown by research to improve student learning and to improve student learning experiences, especially, and so where some of the different strategies that might be engaged. This is not necessarily a process-oriented step 1, step 2, step 3, but it does provide a lot of the critical features and elements that schools should at least consider when pursuing school integration. And this webinar is part of what our web-based package on school integration will look like. So through this, we're looking at crossing the borders between research, policy, and practice, and we're going to also include some short video vignettes on this. So not everybody wants to read an incredible deep literature review that Dr. Erica Frankenberg has partnered with the IDRA EAC-South to do that, but she's also drafting a short summary for those who are maybe wanting to read something and gain some insight, but not as deep of a literature review. Then we'll have state and school-based policies and practices. What are some of the successes going on out there, like what has been shared here today by Metro Nashville and Wake County. And then on the practice side, again, there's the integrated schooling framework. There are best practices that we've identified in newsletters and podcasts that we have drafted either in-house with our own experts and or, partnering with experts outside the office. And then finally, all of these different chapters that we have, from the research to how to use data on this issue, how to engage in some of these different strategies. These will be part of short 3 to 5 to 7 minute videos on different chapters in this work, so that people can get an understanding. And also, importantly, as all the speakers today have mentioned, are the implications for policy and practice. So that's incredibly important. Do we have any other questions right now pending? Michelle?
No, not right now. Let's see here. I see diversity principles and goals on the chart. Do you have a listing of what that looks like?
So I think maybe what
Elaine?
There was a question about diversity goals and principles, and whether or not there's a listing of what that looks like now. There's, definitely input from the community, and the schools should be driving that process, but perhaps, Erica, you can touch a little bit on that, and then Glenn, Beth, and Chris can share briefly their diversity goals and principles that they established.
Sure. Typically, I see this as one of the first parts of the planning process for school districts, either in adopting a new plan or revising a plan. They think about what are the goals that they want to achieve through student assignment, for example. And some of them may be related to diversity, and some of them may not be. So, for example, I think both of the different districts we talked about with here talked about the importance of transportation efficiency. Stability could be another one. Keeping siblings at the same school. So there are lots of different principles, but some of which should be diversity, in part so it can help the community understand how you're thinking about it. I think this is a really good place to bring in some research to talk about why this principle is important. It may be obvious why you want to keep siblings together, or maybe you don't. It may not be as obvious to everyone about the educational benefits for diversity. And so continuing to explain what the school district means, the educational rationale, I think will help then in trying to think about what do the principles mean in practice, because that's where it can get really messy. And so I'm happy to share some examples of some school districts who have done that. I think the last point I would just make is that this is also helpful should there be any kind of legal challenge, to be able to very clearly say, these are the principles that our district supports as goals. And the courts have given a lot of deference to districts who are able to show that the strategies they adopted tie to the goals and the principles that they adopted. And so I think it also, not only in helping the district to understand, or community members to understand, it can also just help in the event of any kind of legal challenge.
So I'll be happy to share some goals or some specific information from Nashville. So I think that before you talk about goals, I think the context for how you measure diversity is important. So in Nashville, our diversity management plan, one of the first things that we did was develop a definition for what does a diverse school look like. And so, for example, if anybody's interested, you can go to our website, and there's diversity initiatives where you can read our diversity management plan and see our annual reports. But in that plan, you can see that we have a specific definition for what is a diverse school. So for a diverse school, it looks at not only the racial, ethnic makeup of the student population, but it also considers the other factors such as income, language, and disability. And so diversity is a broad metric. It's not like one-sided. It's a broader means of which how you look at that. In addition to just the student level diversity, also the staff diversity. So there's a specific metric for looking at certificated and support staff and the differences for diversity there. But when the question was specific to goals. And so goals can be different depending on what district initiative you're speaking of. So for us, the diversity management plan doesn't have a specific goal to say we must increase the number of diverse schools by a specific percentage point every year. But what we do is we seek to monitor the progress that we're making, and as we make district level decisions, that we promote diversity where it's practicable. But there are specific situations where there are goals, like the MSAP grant has very specific diversity goals and targets for marketing and recruiting for these new magnet schools. And so when you get down to some of those district initiatives, like the magnet schools, there are specific diversity goals. And there's other areas where we do have specific goals, but that's just to share a few.
So I think we've touched on our diversity goals when we talked about the magnet objectives and principles, and those are around magnet schools. But as far as for overall all student assignment goals, I don't know that we specifically have them, so that would be something to look at. But for magnet, those 4 goals that we share drive all the decisions we make when we go to the board. We reference those for the reason why we're making a decision, and in many ways it makes it easier having those conversations because we can constantly refer back to them. Another way that we're working to have those play out is with our magnet transportation, because I said we had, good magnet transportation, but it's not all perfectly aligned with those magnet objectives. So we're doing a massive look at magnet transportation, and some schools are going to get better transportation, some are going to get less, depending on how that will help them meet those magnet objectives.
All right, great. Thank you very much. So we're going to be concluding this, but before we do, I want to make sure that people have access, to some of the resources. Again, the IDRA EAC-South is one of 4 regional equity assistance centers that assist school districts in meeting challenges in the areas of race, national origin, sex, gender, and religion. And although today's topic was about racial and national origin integration, sex desegregation still remains a challenge. How and why should schools maybe reconsider single-sex schools if that's what they're thinking about? Again, this all depends on what the school district itself wants. But a great resource is from the Feminist Majority Foundation on Sex Desegregation. The National Coalition on School Diversity has great resources, including very short, clear, understandable research briefs on the benefits of school integration. The U.S. Department of Education and Department of Justice, again, they have the joint guidance that was mentioned earlier. There's several manuals that we have available, and these will be available on our website. Lastly, I wanted to mention that for the Harvard RIDES program, Reimagining Integration, Diverse and Equitable Schools, out of the Harvard University, they have a survey that they would like for folks out there engaging in practice for school desegregation. They're going to be hosting a conference from May 30th to June 1st on practices in this area. So you can find more information, again, at their website there. And again, the IDRA EAC-South, our region covers 11 states plus Washington, D.C. In the South. We're available. We have experts that we work with both in-house and across the region, across the United States. who come in and assist school districts at either no cost or low cost to help in a variety of different ways, whether it is designing zoning plans, whether it is facilitating community group interactions, providing professional development on cultural competency and cultural responsiveness, or to help school districts figure out how best to analyze whether or not they are achieving the benefits of integrated schooling. So we have many different resources that are available to schools and school districts across the region. We do have to have a request from a school district, but that does not mean that through that request we cannot partner with a nonprofit organization. So I appreciate your participation here. Again, more information can be found on our website, and we're happy to also transition information through our upcoming community of practice that we will be having on this topic. We will email everyone the link to all the materials as well as the recorded webinar. Please feel free to share this information with your colleagues as well. So thank you very much again. Thank you so much, Erica, Glenn, Beth, and Chris for sharing your great knowledge here today.